Hey everybody, how are you all doing? This lecture will be for Monday, June 1st. Yes, we are in June. That is quite an accomplishment. We have 10 more class days left. We have 5 days this week and we have 5 days next week. I am putting together a kind of capstone paper for you guys to write that will be due either next Wednesday or Thursday. I will put that in writing either today or tomorrow. So you'll have that. I kind of like to slow the pace down a touch. This last unit is usually what we do in the last week or two, along with reviewing for the Regents and the final. We don't have to review for those. You took your last test of the year. The grades were just posted on Infinite Campus. I don't normally do papers in the fourth quarter, but because we've been home and because we don't have a final or a Regents to really prepare for, I thought, I needed some more grades for you guys. And I do like the papers. I just feel like in the fourth quarter, the review was more important. But without the review, we go right back to the persuasives and things like that we've been doing. So, um, the reason why the 1970s to the current day gets covered very quickly is typically because it's not on the final and the Regents in any kind of quantity. So there may be, let's say out of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, you might see a maximum of 5 questions out of 50 on the Regents or on the school final. So it makes sense. I mean, history looks backward and you need time in order to reflect and build up the academic knowledge and opinions on any given time period. So plenty of books have been written and discussions have been had about the 1970s and 1980s. It's just that we're living in times that are much more like those times than ever from the 1790s or the 1860s, or pick a decade, in the further out historical past, and you see a lot more difference between then and now. So we can understand the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s a lot better because we're living in a time period that reflects it a lot more and things are much more similar. So that's really the idea there. Listen, any decade in American history, you could fill an entire college class semester or multiple semesters on covering and talking about the things that happened during those time periods. But this is general United States history. So we typically go decade by decade or president by president as we move from the 70s towards today. You would never see a Trump question since that's 16 and forward. On a Regents or a final, you might see one Obama question, but usually not, and that's 08 to 16. So really, like, our purview is more 1750s up into 9/11. You could say that that's really more the time period that we're looking at than from 9/11 forward. But we will mention and talk about some things that happened after 9/11, such as the Great Recession, and things like that. So let's move into this. I'd like to try to make my lectures a little bit shorter. I know I'm long-winded, and I apologize for that, but we are in the last 2 weeks. You guys have done a great job. I know that everything is really tough out there right now with all the changes that are going on and the restrictions. There's definitely been a lot more positive news. I hope you guys are following it and staying active in what's going on out there in the world. I definitely do want to schedule a Zoom meeting with you guys probably some point next week to kind of wrap things up and say our goodbyes. So I'll put that together as well. And let's get into this. So we have talked a little bit about, let me go full screen. We have talked a bit about Richard Nixon. He is from California. He is a Republican. As a congressman in the late 1940s, he begins to rise up in political fame by his working against suspected communists with the House on Un-American Affairs activities. Let me get this out here. He then serves as Eisenhower's vice president and as the vice president of a very popular president. Many think that he is going to mop the floor with JFK in the election of 1960, but as we learned last week, JFK is going to beat him up in that presidential debate and beat him in a very, very, very close election in 1960. So we all know what happens with JFK. We all know what happens with Lyndon B. Johnson. And then Nixon is going to reemerge in 1968 as the Republican frontrunner JFK's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was supposed to be the Democratic opposition in 1968, but he is going to be assassinated. So that really takes the biggest rival from Nixon out of the equation, and Nixon is going to be able to win in 1968 and 1972. Now, Nixon obviously is most famous for the Watergate scandal and for the impeachment that was coming and his resignation. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Nixon did some bad things. Nixon did some good things outside of Watergate, so we'll also discuss those. He was a polarizing figure for sure. He represented old school, traditional, conservative values. He ran on that in 1968 in the face of all that protest that we talked about last week with civil rights and the Vietnam War and the counterculture. He was the answer to that. So if you were a older person or a more conservative or religious person in the late 60s and early 70s, Nixon was your guy because he was going to return the country to law and order. He was going to tell these young kids to be quiet and listen to your elders and respect authority and, return the country to its traditional greatness. That was Nixon's main goal and main campaign platform. So when he inherits the presidency in 1968, Vietnam is largely a disaster. It's costing a crazy amount of money. The body count's going up. The draft is wildly unpopular. Celebrities are all against it. The liberals are all against it. And it's time to start unwinding this war. The support for it, as the support for all wars go down as it goes on, is going to be at an all-time low. And Nixon is going to begin withdrawing soldiers in 1973, sending billions in aid in exchange. But by 1975, we are going to have the fall of Saigon. So we don't ever declare defeat in Vietnam. We begin a slow withdrawal of soldiers while we do send money to the South Vietnamese, but it is not enough without American military presence there. Saigon is in South Vietnam. It was the capital, and Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese are going to overrun Saigon when basically all American troops have been removed. So it's a 2-year period of removing troops and sending money, but every troop you remove, you're making the North Vietnamese stronger, and the North Vietnamese are going to win this war. Communism is going to spread, so containment did not work. It is a failure on the part of America's military and foreign policy. It's still looked at that as today as kind of a disaster. 58,000 Americans are dead, 300,000 are wounded, 150 billion is spent, and 3 to 4 million Vietnamese are dead. Many of those who are not actually involved in the war, they are civilian casualties. And I think I mentioned this last week. If you watch any movie or documentary on Vietnam, even if half of what is reported and depicted in those movies and shows is true, it is definitely true that it is a disaster and of epic proportions on the account of the American military and the American government leaders. So Lyndon B. Johnson took a lot of power onto himself with the Vietnam War, starting with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And he said that if I have to fight this kind of war halfway around the world in drips and drabs, it's not going to work. I need more power to use the military as I see fit. And because there was the fear and paranoia of communism and the policy of containment set forth, he was largely granted that. And what it became was a large expenditure of money, no real goals to obtain, very few victories, lots of bad press, lots of protests, lots of civil unrest in the streets as a result, and Congress is going to push back, and they are going to pass the War Powers Act that gave themselves more power in dealing with international conflicts because they were furious with what they saw as a presidential abuse. Now, if the war goes great and the president took more power and produced a great outcome, then this wouldn't have happened. But Vietnam becomes a PR disaster, so now the Congress, in order to save their jobs and their re-election attempts, they have to show that, well, it wasn't us. The president wrestled a lot of power away from us and took too much power, and that's why this thing turned into a disaster. If we had had our normal role in declarations of war and appropriation of funds, this would have never happened. So you have that. The 26th Amendment is going to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. It's passed in the early 1970s, and it's as a result of the draft in Vietnam, which we said is very unpopular. So think about this. You can die for your country at 18, without even volunteering to go into the military. But you can't vote. You can't have a sip of alcohol. All right. So that's going to be a problem. And that is going to lower the voting age to 18. It is very, very difficult to pass an amendment to the Constitution, but this is something that people agree with because the draft affected everybody across the 50 states. People knew somebody that went there and either died or came back with severe PTSD or just felt very resentful that their loved one or friend had to be, non-voluntarily imposed into the military, but couldn't even vote for the political leaders that decided to enact a draft or carry on a war. So I think it makes sense. It certainly makes sense to me that if you're going to be able to get sent to war, then you should be able to vote for who's going to send you there. All right. Now, in terms of Watergate, before the 1972 election, Nixon has a group inside his administration that is a re-election group for his campaign in 1972. And they are going to break in to Democratic headquarters in the Watergate apartment building. And they break in, I believe, twice. They break in, they try to steal some important information to the Democratic Party in hoping to expose them or raise scandals, whatever they needed to do basically to win this election. They also try to wiretap their phones. And it's unsuccessful at first, the wiretapping. So they have the burglars wind up going back in to retap the phones, and a security guard sees something amiss in the building and calls the police, and the burglars are apprehended. All right. Now, it comes, and I don't believe that it's known that Nixon ever actually ordered the burglary itself. But he is concerned about it because he knows what it's going to look like, that he did order the burglary and that's going to be result in some sort of criminal proceeding against him. So he winds up getting reelected. And after he gets reelected, it comes out that he may have directed his attorney to pay hush money to keep the burglars quiet. So in order, I'll pay you money, you take your prison sentence, and we'll work it out that way. You don't say that I knew anything about this. And the actual tape of him telling the attorney to keep the burglars quiet is really what cooked him. So it isn't the crime, it's the cover-up that actually wound up leading to his resignation. So let's watch this quick video here. So again, he is not a president that was impeached. He knew he was going to be impeached, and they tried to fight the releasing of the tapes. And he argued that as president, he had something called executive privilege, which allowed him to basically keep confidential information to himself if it was a matter of national security. Now, one could argue that this was a matter of national security. Of course, he's going to, because he doesn't want to be removed as president, and removing the president could be a matter of national security because it leads to instability and regime change and things like that. But executive privilege does not overstep the Constitution, and the Supreme Court is going to rule that he hand over those tapes. And he knows that once he does, he's basically fried and he's going to have to leave. So rather than sit there and be impeached and go through the indignity of that, he decides to resign from the presidency. First president in history to do that. So let's check out this little video.
Watergate in 1 minute? Are you kidding me? Watergate is a scandal in American history that resulted in the downfall and eventual resignation of Richard Milhous Nixon. Richard Nixon ran for his second term in 1972, and he did not want to lose. He lost in 1960 to JFK. He won in a squeaker in 1968, so 1972 was going to be different. And he had a bunch of people that worked for him, and their nicknames, aptly enough, were the Creeps, the committee to re-elect the president. And basically what occurred is, whether Nixon knew in the beginning or not, I don't know, but it was a plan to infiltrate the Democratic offices at the Watergate Hotel to basically steal their stuff, to find the nitty-gritty, to find the dirt, and to win the election. Unfortunately, the burglars were caught, and even though Nixon trounced in 1972 and won that re-election, it was after that election, through the trials of these burglars, where it became known that they were working for the White House. The Watergate scandal is really about a cover-up rather than the actual burglary, and whether or not Nixon was using his powers in the office of the presidency to basically hide this scandal. When it came known that Nixon had recorded many things in the White House, there was a subpoena issued for these tapes. Nixon refused to give those tapes over, claiming executive privilege. This became the trial, Nixon versus United States, where a unanimous court forced him to give those tapes over. And this is the magic words right here: nobody, Mr. President, is above the law and the Constitution. When Nixon had to give those tapes over, he knew the gig was up, so he quit, got out of town. So there you go, guys. Now you know a little bit about Watergate. Check out a longer video down below to grow your brain 10 times its size, and we'll see you guys next time you press my buttons and where Touch and Go's energy flows.
My apologies. I know that guy is super annoying. I try not to use his videos, but I wanted to give you Watergate in words other than mine in under 2 minutes, so that's all I could find. So yeah, first president. So whether he knew about the initial crime, I don't know that that's ever been revealed. But what was his crime was instructing the lawyer to cover up a crime that was committed in his name. So if Nixon didn't know about the burglary, but his White House people did order the burglary, then that is still a problem for his administration and for his White House, because it comes out of his people. So he's responsible for it, and then the cover up to it is really going to be what becomes the crime. All right. And then he says, well, I'm the president, I can't be accused of a crime. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you absolutely can be accused of a crime, because and you committed one. And at that point, he knew that Congress and the Senate was going to vote him out. So he decided to hang it up and resign. So let's talk about some of the good things that he did. Nixon, you could argue, largely puts us on the pathway we are today with China. In terms of us being in diplomatic relations with China, if you remember, they were one of the 5 nations on the Security Council. But after Mao Zedong and the communists took over, America, France, and Britain decided that they were going to do whatever they could to keep China weak and quiet as a communist country, because a communist China mixed with a communist Soviet Union was an issue for them. So China, they're going to start to pick up diplomatic relations and international relations with China. Trade is going to start to really, really move in an upward trajectory, and they are our number 1 trading partner today. Nixon's kind of sneaky take on this is that a stronger China, or let's say a China that's tied more to America, makes the Soviet Union more weak, because there's a tremendous fear that with the size of the Soviet Union and China, and them both being communist countries, and them both being in the same part of the world, that they could join forces and become this, immovable communist bloc. That is going to be part of his reasoning for wanting to establish a new relationship with China. He's also going to ease tensions with the Soviet Union. We're coming out of the Vietnam War. There's less of an appetite. There's, I guess, less of a fear and a paranoia towards the Soviets. So it's called détente, which is just basically a fancy word for, or a French word, let's say, for the easing of tensions with a bitter enemy. All right. So the avoidance of conflict becomes more important than containment, which is a major shift in foreign policy. Now, Reagan in the 80s is going to take a more hardline tactic against the Soviets. So yes, they're both Republicans, but Nixon, because of Vietnam, has to kind of take his foot off the pedal with communism and the Soviets. Reagan, because time had passed, is going to be able to put his foot back on that pedal, but we'll talk about that more. So this is just about staying peaceful and prosperous and not getting involved in these containment wars, because Korea was a bit of a mess, Vietnam was a huge mess, and now we're 25 years after the end of World War II and the dropping of the bomb, and America has not really used its military in a smart way since that time. So, and you can make that argument today that really since World War II, the American military, it's very different. I mean, we understood what we were fighting for in World War II. And you could say that we also knew what we were fighting for in Afghanistan in 2001 because of 9/11, because we were attacked. But there's been a lot of mishaps. There's been a tremendous spending of money. There's bases all over the world. We spend more than anybody else in the country, and there's a lot more and more people saying, well, what are we gaining by doing all of this? All right. So the beginning of the military industrial complex starts in the 1950s, and Eisenhower is going to warn against it. And Vietnam is proof that it can, when stretched too much, can become a problem for our country. All right. They're going to pass SALT agreements with strategic arms limitation treaty. They're arms control treaties. Remember, we're in a arms race, if you will. We build a weapon, the Soviets build the weapon, we build more weapons, they're more sophisticated, they're more destructive, they can kill more people. More and more weapons in the world, I think we would all agree, makes the potential for the world to become more violent and more people to die based on misunderstandings. So this is going to be a pushback against that, and the idea that we should limit the amount of arms that we have, especially nuclear arms. Now, on the domestic front, they want to slow inflation. Inflation is going to start taking off in the late 60s and early 70s. And what that means is that your dollar buys you less. So as the price of goods go up, if wages don't also increase, I don't know what this is. Now my wife is calling. What is happening? We're going to decline her. She's not going to be happy. Okay, let's go back to this. Now, my apologies on that. So, inflation. The value of the dollar goes down as the price of goods go up. If, let's say, why can't I think of this? If the wages do not also match the growth of the price of goods, then your dollar is worth less in terms of what you can buy. So inflation is a big problem for any economy, just like the unemployment numbers are as well. Those are the major two problems that an economy can face. Inflation usually means higher interest rates. Higher interest rates means less investment, less people buying homes, less people buying stocks. So inflation can have a very contractionary effect on an economy. And when contraction happens, people get less wealthy. Businesses are less wealthy. They'll hire less people, and that becomes an issue. There's a decrease in support for Great Society social programs. That was LBJ's food stamps and the war on poverty and Medicare and Medicaid. So the idea that Republicans are against those programs and Democrats are for them, you're going to start to see those battle lines definitely being drawn that we see today. Strengthen law and order. Increase the size of the police force. Protest on TV. Republicans were not happy with that. People throwing things at the police. People occupying Capitol buildings and young people speaking out. All right. Now, protest is protected in the First Amendment, but when protest turns violent and gets nasty, as we've seen in these last couple of days, that is certainly not protected in the First Amendment. You have the right to protest until you hurt someone else or put someone else in danger. So Nixon is definitely going to capitalize on the protest sentiment that's out there and those who did not like that idea. All right, so they discourage protests. He's going to move. Here she is calling again. I'm going to decline her again. Sorry, I don't know how to pause this and deal with her, so I will call her back quickly. Move slowly on civil rights. Appoint conservative judges. Those are all, or let's say appointing conservative judges would definitely be part of the Republican handbook, as just like Democrats would want to put more liberal judges into federal judgeships and Supreme Court positions. He begins the war on drugs. Now, the war on drugs, in my opinion, and I will give you my opinion here, is an absolute disaster. Trillions of dollars spent, and the rates of drug use are going up in America. It's never really worked. Plenty of drug dealers still out there. I'm not saying that drugs is a good thing, but if you throw trillions of dollars at something and you can't drive the amount of drug dealers and drug users and addicts down, then I don't see how your policies are actually working. So I don't believe that all drugs should be legal, but I do believe that nonviolent drug offenders should have either have no sentences and community service, or should have very, very lenient sentences. If you commit a violent crime related to drugs, then yes, you should absolutely be prosecuted and put in jail. But if you are a drug user, or you're caught with drugs, or you're not a drug dealer and you're not hurting anybody else, I would argue more on the side of individual liberty and freedom. If somebody wants to kill themselves with drugs, I know it's not ideal, but I don't see what the government's really going to be able to do about it. And putting people in jail for using drugs has not deterred other people from using them and becoming addicted. So to me, it's a big mess. I know there's many different sides of this equation, and people would argue against it, and that's fine. Everybody has the right to their opinion. But just as a business person and somebody that looks at wanting return on tax dollars, if my tax dollars is going to go to a war on anything or a war in any place, I want to know what the goals are, and I want to see progress. And the war on drugs has seen very, very little progress. So it's still here today in one form or another. It's kind of waxed and waned, but we're still spending a whole lot of money on drug enforcement and not getting much back for our expenditure. And we don't need to talk about the Clean Air and Water Bill or the creation of the EPA. I guess the one thing is the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, which is, most of the time today we look at Democrats as more involved in the environment and not so much Republicans. But yet here's a Republican creating the EPA in the first place and the Clean Air and Water Bill. So would a Republican today have created the EPA? Probably not. But we pointed out because Nixon, was super conservative on some things, but also being, at least by today's standards, more liberal, quote unquote, when it came to the environment. Here's his picture. And I'll leave you with that. Hope you're all doing well. Let me go call my wife before she tries to divorce me. And I'll get this up on Ed Puzzle for tomorrow morning. And I hope everybody's doing well, and I'll see you guys soon.